You are the overall commander of a force that is entering its third day of hard fighting. You're pretty confident in your strong position and your logistics, but then all of a sudden, thousands of enemy soldiers begin emerging from that wood line before us here, and there is no one here to stop them. What happened? Well, let's find out. So we are currently standing on the ground that is home to the Brotherton cabin. Now, originally manning this position was James Negley's division, and due to some early morning shuffling, Negley's men would be pulled from this location and Thomas Wood's division would fill the gaps here. Now, as Wood's division was coming into this area, a handful of bold Confederate skirmishers took over this area around the Brotherton cabin, and Wood would deploy 2 companies from the 100th Illinois Infantry, advance across this field and drive out those Confederate skirmishers. Now, those 2 companies of the 100th Illinois were commanded by Colonel Fred Bartleson, and his men would clear out the skirmishers and the Confederates would pull back into the wood line across the Lafayette Road like you see before us here. Now, shortly after Wood would man this area, he would receive some confusing orders from General Rosecrans. He was essentially instructed to support another division a little farther down and fill in a gap. Well, in turn, Wood would pull his men out of this location and create a 600-yard wide gap in the Union line to fill a gap that wasn't even there. And just as the last of Wood's men were leaving this location, thousands of Confederates would emerge screaming from this wood line. Now, these were hard-hitting veterans from the Army of Northern Virginia under the command of General James Longstreet. His corps was moved from the Eastern Theater to the Western Theater to help bolster Bragg's army. And in turn, Longstreet was put in command of an entire wing of Bragg's army. So Longstreet's men would pour out of the wood line here, and essentially those 2 companies of the 100th Illinois Infantry were caught in a pretty bad predicament because there was completely nothing in this area here. And just through the wood line here was General Rosecrans' headquarters. So things were getting a little dire here for the Union. Now, no matter how experienced you are as a commander, no matter how battle-hardened the men you command are, sometimes all you need is a little luck. And as the Union forces were pulling out of this location to fill a gap that didn't exist, they inadvertently created a gap here. And just as the last of the Union troops here were leaving, thousands and thousands of Confederates were pouring out of the wood line behind you on the camera here. And sometimes all you need is just a little luck to sway the momentum here. Now, the 2 companies from the 100th Illinois were still in possession of this area. So you essentially had less than 300 men fighting an entire corps of the Confederate Army here. And obviously you know that that didn't bode well for the Union in this location. So we are looking at the wood line where Longstreet's assault would take place on the morning of September 20th of 1863. And keep in mind, by this point in the battle, you already had heavy fighting taking place down here in this direction near the modern-day visitor center. You had a farm owned by John McDonald, and Breckinridge's division was involved heavily there. You also had numerous other divisions involved attacking Thomas's line in that direction. But emerging from the woods before us here, just across the Lafayette Road, were thousands of men under the command of James Longstreet. So they would surge across into this area, meeting little resistance. Keep in mind, those 2 companies of the 100th Illinois pretty much offered little to no resistance. A handful of those men would try to take shelter in the Brotherton cabin to offer some sort of resistance, but they were quickly overwhelmed. And pouring through this area here were thousands of Confederate forces, and there was nothing to stop them. So just to offer a few more visuals for you, you can see just a gray tidal wave advancing right at the handful of Union skirmishers in this area. You can see the Brotherton cabin there in the distance, and we look up and there's the Brotherton cabin there. And we mentioned how there was fighting elsewhere here. So in the morning you had a lot of action taking place in Polk's wing attacking Thomas's line here. And then as you can see, we are right in the middle of Longstreet's breakthrough here. And you can kind of see how he stacked his men. So there was depth to his attack. It wasn't just one long line. And you can break through and then you lose momentum and you pull back like you've seen so many times. There is depth. Look at all these units stacked on top of each other, punching through this area right here. This is where the breakthrough took place here on September 20th of 1863, and this is where the momentum truly shifts in favor of the Confederacy.
I heard the pickets fire one round. Immediately afterwards, I discovered that they were coming back to the line in haste. Then almost simultaneously, volleys of musketry broke forth in front and on my right flank. There were some large pine trees near me, and the needles from these pines commenced falling in showers to the ground, having been cut loose by the bullets fired at my men. Then the rebel battle flags began to show themselves at the breastworks on my right. There was a hand-to-hand struggle for a few minutes, then more volleys of musketry on the right and left flanks as well as in front. The brigade on my left had been flanked and driven away. With attacks in front and on both flanks simultaneously, it was impossible for my troops to hold their position. The line melted away. Brigadier General William Carlin.
So we've moved locations, and just to reorient you, through this wood line right here, the other side of that wood line is the Brotherton cabin. So the Confederates would break through that wood line, and all of a sudden, Major General Rosecrans, who had his headquarters set up right here in this location, was witnessing thousands and thousands of Confederates pursuing just a handful of Union skirmishers here. Imagine the dismay of Rosecrans here. You know, on the morning of September 20th, things were pretty good for the Union. They had a pretty strong defensive line all along the Lafayette Road. And, you know, this is the Army's third day of hard fighting. Who knows when the last time that Rosecrans even had a full night of sleep. And he ordered a Union division that was originally occupying this area to move elsewhere. And just as that happened, Longstreet launches his assault. Now you had almost 11,000 Confederates bearing down on this location. I believe that's almost 8 brigades. So think about just the sheer manpower that is. And there is almost little to nothing to stop those forces from bearing down on Rosecrans' position here. Now Rosecrans and the rest of the officers in this location did what they could to essentially try to rally the blue wave that was headed towards this area, but to no avail. So Rosecrans, and along with his staff and about a third of the Union Army on the field, would pull back and leave the field here at Chickamauga, and they would head towards the McFarland Gap and eventually regroup in Chattanooga, which is in this direction here. Now, just to give you another example of how quick things changed here at Chickamauga, here is obviously Rosecrans' headquarters. Panning to my left, the wood line where the Confederates would break through, and right here is where Longstreet would set up his headquarters once the Confederate forces broke through this area. So another example of just how quick things changed here at Chickamauga. Now, despite this chaos and confusion, and the momentum is completely in the hands of the Confederate forces now, there were a handful of Union brigades who tried to stem the tide here and essentially buy time for the Army to get itself together. And we are going to head to a location just up the way here where a Union brigade was just absolutely mauled.
Our lines now emerge from the forest into open ground on the border of long open fields, over which the enemy were retreating under cover of several batteries. General Bushrod Johnson
Now, following the Confederate breakthrough here, Union command was scrambling to try and slow down this oncoming Confederate wave here, and they were able to muster a handful of brigades in this area to try and slow down and organize some sort of defense. Now, one of those brigades was under the command of Brigadier General William Lytle. Now, Lytle, before the war, was a poet, and once he enlisted in the Union Army, he was known as the Poet General. So Lytle's brigade would come into line of battle in this general area here, and the Confederate forces were only about 50 yards from this location as Lytle's brigade was forming up. So you can just see that there wasn't a whole lot of time to prepare yourself, and there wasn't a whole lot of time to get your men organized and in formation before the Confederate forces just through the woods here and into that field. That's where they were positioned.
All right, men. We can die but once. This is the time and place. Let us charge. If we can whip them today, we will eat our Christmas dinner at home. Brigadier General William Lytle.
Now, we mentioned the Confederates were about 50 yards from this location where Lytle's brigade would come into line of battle. Now, they would begin firing point blank into essentially each other's faces. Now, if you know anything about Civil War weapons, 50 yards is pretty close, and men were dropping like flies on both sides. Now, Lytle's men were up against a very large brigade under Brigadier General Zachariah Dees. Now, although Lytle's brigade was outnumbered in this area, they were holding firm because of their rather strong position here. So I'm going to pan back to my left. Now, Lytle's men were positioned in a little high ground here in this general area. And let me back up a little more. And I'm going to pan back to the field here. And you can kind of see pretty open fields of fire here. Now, it does dip down, so there is a little bit of cover. But the Confederates here, assaulting this position, suffered pretty heavily. But in turn, Lytle's men were paying the price as well. Now, I moved a little farther back because I do want to offer another perspective of the fighting here. So again, Lytle's men holding this position in that field. You had Confederate forces under the command of Zachariah Dees coming straight at us. And again, this was close quarters fighting. Now, Lytle was wounded several times trying to organize some sort of defense here and prevent his men from fleeing, because there isn't much on the Union right in this location. Now, as Lytle was continuing to command this location, a Confederate minie-ball would strike his mouth, and Lytle would fall from his horse, killed in action right here in this area here. And panning back to my right, the area where his brigade was manning, fighting so desperately to try and maintain some sort of defense here. And once Lytle was killed in action, the Union defense here on the right essentially began collapsing. And you really can't blame the men. They were already up against overwhelming odds. And now their commander, who sounds like he was pretty highly respected amongst his men, is now killed in action. And the Poet General lays down his life in defense of his country right here in this spot, September 20th of 1863. Now, something else to note here, Lytle was killed here around noon on September 20th. And if you recall earlier in the video, Longstreet began his assault and breakthrough around 11:15 in the morning of September 20th. So within 45 minutes, the Union line was collapsing and victory was within grasp of the Confederacy. Now, I don't know if you just heard that, but those aren't cannons booming in the distance. That is some weather moving into the area. So with that, this is what's now called Lytle's Hill.
One member of the 24th Wisconsin recalled, "The rebels were positively so close to us all this time that we could almost see the whites of their eyes. They crawled up stealthily behind logs, trees, and bushes.
With an increased shout and rapidity of step, we drove the enemy with great slaughter and pursued through the open field." Colonel Samuel McSpadden, 19th Alabama.
It's always a humbling reminder when you come out to battlefields like this and you learn about the personal stories. You know, Lytle was a poet before the war. He had a whole entire life, and the war broke out, he joined up, and it really just shows that no matter what you did before the war, it doesn't matter. War will take everything from you, and if it doesn't take your mind and your body, it's going to take your life. And it's always a good reminder when you come to places like this. And again, I've said it before and I'll say it again, war is just a terrible thing. So as you can see, we moved once again, so let's reorient ourselves. Several hundred yards in this direction was Rosecrans' headquarters, along with Lytle Hill, which we just visited. And we're currently in the area a little farther north, where John Bell Hood's division of Longstreet's Corps would have advanced through. So they would come through this area and essentially begin driving in this location here across what is now called Dyer Field. And they would meet some pretty heavy resistance here. You had men under the command of Charles Harker for the Union along a fence line here. I don't know if the camera's picking it up, but they were delivering some pretty heavy fire against Hood's corps here. And Hood, seeing this, he would run on horseback, because remember, he was injured just a few months prior at the Battle of Gettysburg. So he was on horseback, and he would grab the regimental flag from his old regiment, the 4th Texas, and he began trying to rally his men and continue the assault up Dyer Field here and try to stem the tide and continue the momentum of the Confederate forces in this general area. So we've made our way into the woodline there. We were just about 50 yards in this direction on the established paved road, and we mentioned how Hood's division was assaulting through this direction here and across Dyer Field. And Charles Harker's men were right across this field manning a fence line, delivering some pretty withering fire in this general location. Hood noticed his men began to stagger a bit, grabbed the flag of his old regiment, the 4th Texas, and began attempting to rally his men. Well, anytime there's an officer on horseback, especially waving a regimental flag, he is a prime target. Well, a Union minie ball would strike John Bell Hood's right thigh, and he would be wounded right here in this spot on September 20th of 1863. Now, something interesting about Hood's wounding here is that bullet struck Hood pretty high on the thigh, and the higher you get on the leg, the harder it is to occlude the bleeding. So especially when you get near the pelvis. I don't mean to interject my civilian occupation into the history videos, but Hood would obviously survive this wound and command the Army of Tennessee in months to come. But I think it's pretty incredible that not only did he survive a wound at Gettysburg, he survived his wound here at Chickamauga, which is probably worse. Again, that minie ball struck him pretty high on the thigh, and you can't really occlude that bleeding. And there's a lot of major vessels in the thigh, and the thigh itself can hold a lot of blood. So Hood's wound here was rather serious and a pretty big blow to the Confederacy, at least at this moment in the battle here.
The meanest, most unsatisfactory place I struck during the whole war. Val Giles, 4th Texas.
So that was the Confederate breakthrough here at Chickamauga on September 20th of 1863. It seems like the Confederates have victory truly within grasp this time, but in spite of all that success that they just had, fighting would continue here for hours, and in that fighting, a legend would arise, and that's something we're going to cover on a later episode.